Okay, good evening Year 11. So we are now on to the English Literature paper 2, which are going to be sitting tomorrow. This is the night before news video to help you prepare for that exam. Just to go through some of the key details, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes and the paper is split up into 3 sections. First is an inspector calls, where you will get a choice of 2 questions. You answer one of them, and that could be on a character or a theme. And the difference between an inspector calls and the other questions, especially Macbeth and the Christmas Carol, is that you don't get an extract to support. So it's really important that you have some quotes from the text that you can use in your essay to not only support your evidence but also to analyse, because that's one of the key things on the mark scheme. You then have the 2 poetry sections, the first of which is the Power and Conflict poetry. So this is one poem from the Power and Conflict anthology, one of the 15 poems that we've studied, and that one is printed, and you're asked to compare that poem to another poem of your choice which is not printed in terms of how the poets present a similar theme. So it could be something like conflict or war or nature or power or identity, any of the themes that we've studied. Lastly, there's the unseen poetry, which is split into 2 questions. The first is an analysis of the first unseen poem that you get, and the second is a comparison of a second unseen poem that you get with the first one that you've already written about. Okay, so it's a long paper, there's lots of details, so it would be worth going back over some of those details tonight, just so that you're clear. But for this session, I'm going to focus on 2 really key things for an inspector calls and the anthology poetry to give you some things to talk about in tomorrow's exam. So you're going to need a pen and some paper for this session. Okay, so we're going to start with an inspector calls, and we're going to start with a key character, the inspector, which will allow us to not just revise his character but also really revise Priestley's key messages. So the first thing I'd like you to do is to mind map some ideas about the inspector. What does he do in the play, who does he represent, and how could we link it to Priestley's message? Okay, so here are some examples of things that you could have put in your mind map. So you can see the first point in the top left hand corner in red. The inspector represents the moral force for good. He is the kind of conscience of the play. He's Priestley's mouthpiece, and Priestley constructs him to be omniscient, all-knowing, to undermine the cruelty of the capitalist upper classes. So Priestley uses the inspector to undermine the established order in society. Okay, so he does this in 2 ways. Firstly, he does this by criticising each member of the Burling family and trying to dismantle the class system that kind of protects them, the power and the wealth and the social status that protects them. And you can see some evidence there underneath, for example, what he says to Mr. Burling, for example, his final message in the play about fire and blood and anguish, and how that links also to the changes that Priestley wanted to see in society. So the bottom 2 boxes in the right hand corner points about the context and when the play was written. Remember that the play is written and performed in 1945 at the end of World War II, but it is set in 1912, which is a couple of years before the start of World War I. So Priestley's trying to show the 1945 audience the kind of attitude that they should have through the inspector's criticism of the class system. Okay, secondly, the inspector is also a force for good because he advocates for Eva Smith. That means he supports or argues for her or defends her. And remember that Eva Smith is more widely representing the exploited working class. So he again and again tries to advocate for those kind of people who are exploited and looked down upon by the upper class, and that plays into his message as well. So some ideas there that you could have had in your mind map. Okay, so our next step is to plan our response, starting with the thesis statement. So based on what we just said in the previous slide, have a go at writing your introduction, your thesis statement, as to what the purpose, what the point of the character of the inspector is, and what Priestley's using the inspector to demonstrate. Here is an example of a thesis statement. So we're talking about the inspector embodying or representing the socialist viewpoints that Priestley wanted to see in society in 1945, and how the inspector acts as a mouthpiece, or another key word, representing directly Priestley's views. But the key thing underneath that is that attack on the class system and an attack on the abuse and the exploitation of the working class, advocating for socialist society, advocating for the working class and being a force for moral good in the play. So to support our thesis statement, we will now need some evidence. And remember, as I said in the introduction, this is the only question where you do not get any of the text printed for you. So it's absolutely essential that you have quotations remembered, so that A, you can support your argument with evidence, direct quotations, but B, that you can analyse evidence to support what you're saying with a comment on the writer's methods. So think about evidence now for two things. Firstly, the inspector's critical views of the Burlings, and secondly, for the inspector advocating or supporting Eva Smith and the working class. Okay, so here are some quotes that we could have used, two for each. So the inspector's critical views of the Burlings. Each of you helped to kill her, remember that, never forget it. So the short sentences there trying to pass the guilt and the blame onto the Burlings, make them feel that guilt, make them feel that sense of shame and from their actions. Linked to that, the comment to Mr. Burling that public men have responsibilities as well as privileges. So this idea of social responsibility, of being accountable for what you do, and of trying to care for other people, that goes hand in hand with being someone who is wealthy and important, which Mr. Burling doesn't kind of accept. And then for the inspector advocating for Eva Smith, we've got a couple of quotes here. There's some others that you could use, but these are some examples. So the way that the inspector demonstrates that Eva Smith is not just an isolated case, she is part of a wider pattern. So there are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in the country. Similar to what he says at the end of the play, when he says there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths left with us. So the idea that Eva Smith isn't just an individual, she's representative of something much wider. And then his description is a very blunt, graphic descriptions of Eva Smith's suicides, burnt her inside out. She was in great agony, trying to give that sense of accountability and shame to the Burlings through the graphic description of her death. So the next stage is really important, especially for an inspector calls, because we need to remember quotes, but also it's really important that we analyse those quotes that we've used, because that's the only way that we can get analysis marks on this question, because we don't have an extract. So here are the steps outlined. These are similar to videos that you've seen before, so we'll get straight into an example on the next slide. Okay, so we've chosen the quote here, each of you helped to kill her, remember that, never forget it, which is the inspector trying to make the Burlings feel a sense of guilt and shame for their actions towards Eva Smith. So follow the steps on the previous slide, write that quote down and then explode it in as much detail as possible, looking for any methods used by the writer, so techniques, language or structural techniques, as well as analysing individual word choices. So here is a modelled example of that quote. So we've got the method identified as short, declarative sentences, which I touched on briefly. But these short statements re-emphasise or reinforce the blame, and the inspector is being very direct, using the pronoun you, giving them a clear sense of their responsibility. Okay. Also in there, the individual words remember and never give a sense of permanence, like the pain that the Burlings have kind of gone through needs to be remembered and not forgotten, which it is by Eric and Sheila, but it's not by Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and to a lesser extent Gerald. So that's an interesting quote that we could kind of compare to the reactions of the Burlings after this. And we've lastly got the verb kill, which gives a sense of a crime and of a responsibility again for Eva's suffering. So same again for this quote. So this one is touching on the agony and pain that Eva Smith felt, and the way that the inspector describes it to the Burlings in a very blunt, direct, graphic manner. So again, identifying methods that you can, and then have a go at analysing and exploding individual word choices. Here is the modelled example. So we've got graphic imagery, which means very violent or direct or upsetting almost. So the inspector is being very direct in the way that he describes Eva Smith's death. And we've got the words there, burnt and agony, creating a semantic field of suffering, which represents more widely the suffering that the working class experience at the hands of the rich. The word great as well emphasises the extent of Eva Smith's suffering and how that kind of reflects on the Burling's own actions. And again, we've got a sense of kind of finality in the shortness of the clauses. We've also got a ellipsis in the middle, which might suggest that the inspector is pausing for dramatic effect here. We could also talk about that when using this quotation. Okay, so lastly, we're putting all of what we've just done into a model paragraph. So you can see here how we've got our thesis statement in green, we've got our evidence in yellow, we've got our technique or method in purple, the analysis of the evidence following that in blue, and then really importantly the link back to context and writer's intention. Okay, so use this as a model, write your own paragraph about how Priestley presents the inspector, but use a different quote and try to vary the points that are being made here, but use this as a model for a really good, well-structured paragraph that hits all of the assessment objectives. Okay, we're now going to move on to the second question for today, which is the power and conflict anthology comparison question, and we're going to look specifically at the theme of the power of nature, taking 2 out of the 15 poems to give you an example of the kind of things you could be saying, not just if these poems come up, but if any of the poems come up in terms of structure, skills, and the paragraph style as well. Okay, so the question we're going to be revising today is using Ozymandias as the named poem. This is a poem that has come up previously, but it is one of the poems in the anthology that is perhaps easier to remember because it's shorter and, really importantly, compares well with a lot of other poems. Okay, so the poems that you could compare it to we're going to talk about on the next slide, but even if Ozymandias doesn't come up, it's one of the poems that we would recommend revising really well to use as your comparison poem. A, you can remember quotes from it probably, and B, it's quite well known in terms of its themes and ideas. So that's why we're using this as our example. Okay, so on the screen is a list or a mind map of the different poems that you could compare Ozymandias to. We'll start with points about Ozymandias first. So on the left hand side in red, we've got the points about how the power of humanity is temporary in comparison to the permanence of nature because of the fact that the statue disintegrates over time. Ozymandias' hubris, his arrogance, is undermined, and it shows that power is actually temporary, whereas nature is kind of everlasting. And that acts as an allegory, the statue acts as an allegory or representation of the idea that power doesn't last, and that even the most powerful must suffer a fall and a dent to their pride. Okay, so what poems could we compare Ozymandias to if we were talking about the power of nature and we had that as our question? We could compare it to Exposure, Wilfred Owen's poem from the First World War, The Trenches, where nature is in conflict with the soldiers, and nature is actually presented as the most powerful and most dangerous enemy in a conflict situation. We could compare it to Storm on the Islands, which also presents a situation where nature is more powerful than humanity. The islanders have to survive the storm and get through it, and have to be able to not be kind of overwhelmed by it, even though it's a terrifying force. The Prelude as well would link quite closely to that. Wordsworth's experience of going out on a boat across the lake and being overwhelmed and overpowered by the threatening presence of the mountain, and how that showed him that nature is more powerful than man, we can't control nature, and that it kind of undermines our own sense of purpose. And lastly, you could, slightly differently to nature, but if the question was slightly different, perhaps about power instead, a good poem to compare Ozymandias to would be London, because both poems talk about the abuse of power and how power can be used to oppress and to control others, which Ozymandias did at the time that he was alive, and that Blake describes in his version of London. Okay, so similarly to the other videos, we're now going to plan our thesis statement. The difference with this, however, is that we need to remember it's a comparison poem. So, a comparison question. So firstly, we've chosen the poem that you're going to compare. So we've gone for Ozymandias and Exposure. And what we first need to do is to think about the shared ideas in both poems that link to that theme of the power of nature. So underneath, plan out or write out 3 shared comparative ideas that link both of these poems. Here are your examples. So we've got the ideas from Ozymandias that nature is more powerful than humanity, human power is temporary and will never last, and that the time will destroy the legacy of even the most powerful people. And then for exposure, we've got the idea that nature is a powerful and overwhelming force. Nature is more potent and enemy than the opposition, and that the futility of war is emphasised by the lack of action in the trenches. So you would have to kind of sift through those points and think, okay, which ones are most relevant to this question, and which ones would I want to focus on? I would say the first 2 points for each poem are the most closely linked and would allow you to compare the similarities in that big idea, but also the differences in how it's expressed in the poems. So to support the thesis statement, we now need evidence. You are going to have one of these poems printed in the exam, so it'll always be easier to find evidence from that printed poem because it's there in front of you. But we are also aiming to remember quotes from the non-printed poem, from the one that you have chosen to compare it to. So recommending 3 or 4 easy to remember quotes for each poem that you can slot into your essays. So have a go at that now. 3 quotes for Ozymandias talking about the power of nature and 3 for exposure. So here are the suggestions. So we've got for Ozymandias, a shattered visage lies, whose sneer of cold command. So that's a description of the statue, but also importantly a juxtaposition between what it is now, a shattered visage, it's ruined, it's destroyed by time, by nature, and what it used to look like, what it still looks like, but what the purpose of it was originally, which was to demonstrate Ozymandias' power. The sneer of cold command shows his arrogance and his oppressive rule over the people that he had underneath him. We've also got a contrast there when the statue is described in detail and talks about Ozymandias' powers, and then Shelley follows that up with a short declarative sentence, nothing beside remains. So all of the things that Ozymandias built at the time, not just this statue, but the buildings and the cities around it, are all vanished. So that again shows the emptiness of his power and how it hasn't lasted. Lastly, the description of the colossal wreck. So again, what's happened to the statue over time. The lone and level sands stretch far away. So that's a description of the permanence of nature and how nature is more powerful than man. For exposure, we've got a couple of quotes here for the power of nature and how it attacks the soldiers in the trenches. So the merciless iced east wind that knives us, and dawn massing in the east hurt a melancholy army. Both of those quotes use personification, which Owen uses repeatedly in the poem to create that sense of battle and aggression and attack, and how nature is essentially fighting and is the aggressor in that relationship with man. We've also got the repeated refrain at the end of each stanza, but nothing happens. So that lack of action and how that almost creates a vacuum in which nature can attack and destroy the soldiers. Again, a reminder for the steps for the quotation explosion. You've seen this before, so I won't go over it in too much detail, but we're going to apply this now to a quote from Ozymandias. Okay, so here's our first quotation explosion. We've got the quote, a shattered visage lies, whose sneer of cold command. So here we're asking you to pick out and comment on the word shattered, on the word sneer, and on the word cold or cold command, and also identifying a method if you can. Have a look now at the modelled example. So this is the kind of detail that you should have gone into. The method is just adjective choice, so it doesn't always have to be a kind of technique or an impressive kind of, technique or language technique or structural technique. So word choice is important, and it's a technique. So we've got shattered as an adjective, suggests the statue is physically destroyed. Not just destroyed, but completely destroyed with nothing really left of it. And it's a shattered visage. The visage is the face of the statue, which once expressed Ozymandias' power through the sneer, which we'll talk about in a minute, but is now shattered. So it's a representation of his, the removal of his authority. The sneer that used to be there, or that still is there, but that is kind of shattered now, that was originally supposed to demonstrate his superiority and arrogance, which could link to how he titles himself the King of Kings, which is a comparison with God. And that is now ironic because his arrogance is completely undermined by the fact that his statue is shattered. And in cold command, we've got that sense of harshness, of aggressiveness, of a lack of empathy and emotion, but also the harsh alliterative sound, cold command, suggests the kind of brutal, tyrannical way that Ozymandias ruled. Okay, so here's our model paragraph. So this is only half of the paragraph, and this will follow the same structure as many of the other paragraphs that we've kind of looked at. So thesis statement, evidence, writer's method, analysis, and then link to context and writer's intention. The difference is, as I'll show you on the next slide, that we need to then link and compare with the second poem. So have a look at this one, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the same paragraph, just with your sentence starter for the next section down the bottom in yellow. So this could be the same paragraph. You could keep it without a break, or if you find it easier to structure, that could start a new paragraph. But the key thing is that you're using a connective phrase at the start of that shows that you're comparing, that it's either a similarity or difference. So this one is similarly, which is obviously a similarity, but then you've also got however, because that's showing a difference. So although they talk about nature being more powerful than man, they do it in both ways. So that's where you get your marks for comparison. So what I'd like you to do now is to think about what we did for the quote from Ozymandias. Choose one from exposure, explode it in the same way, and then try and write the next paragraph of this answer, comparing how nature is powerful in exposure, but that power is presented differently to Ozymandias.